Hi, audience.
All right, I think we can get started. Welcome to the Cultural Intelligence Speaker Series as a part of the Comprehensive Plan Update. I'm Alex Majeski. I'm with Cushing Terrell, the lead consultant on the project. Just a plug for next week, we'll be doing economic development as well. Same time, same place. We're joined by our two lovely panelists today, Bill and Gretchen, and we have a few questions here we'll be asking them. We have an audience as well who is welcome to ask any questions they might like. So please just raise your hand and we can get that question out there. Panelists, I would ask you to repeat the question in the microphone after an audience member might ask so we can hear it for the video. Otherwise, I think we can get started. Let's start with a easy one. What is cultural intelligence? Bill, can you get started for us?
Sure. It's interesting to think about cultural intelligence. I frame it more on cultural awareness, and from my perspective, it's more about knowing my own identity and who I am as a human being from a cultural perspective, and then understanding that everyone that I interact with has a different culture. And so as I increase my own cultural awareness around my identity, my ethnicity, my beliefs and values, then it creates more understanding that everyone that I interact with has a different set of those. Even if we might have a similar belief, we have a different way of interacting with it. And so the cultural awareness just allows me to move between conversations and interactions in a way that I'm recognizing that this person is different in some way and not really judging or labeling it, and just kind of seeing where can we make a connection and how can we interact with each other in a way that doesn't devalue or dehumanize the other person because we have a different approach or different cultural awareness around each other.
Thank you, Bill. I should say, too, maybe we would like to introduce yourself as a part of that question as well, and talk a little bit about your experience and what you're representing. Thank you.
Okay. Should I go ahead and do that now?
Yeah, please.
Okay. My name is Bill De La Cruz. I've been in Boulder County since 1979. I've served on the school board here and have been really involved in the community over the years. I have a business called De La Cruz Leadership Solutions, and I call myself a connector of hearts because what I really do is I work with people and organizations talking about culture and identity and really getting people to think about how our biases and judgments and stereotypes impact how we see each other. So really looking at our human condition in terms of how those things are created, the impact they have when we use them against each other, and how we deconstruct them. And I am a published author, I do keynotes, and I travel the country and work in a variety of settings, just working with people about how you have a conversation that doesn't get divisive or dehumanizing, and I have to take into the context of the world that we live in today, which is also challenging our abilities to do that. So I'm really excited. This is a topic that I'm sharing with Gretchen. I talk about all the time, as I'm sure she does as well. So I'll just stop there.
And I'm Gretchen Armijo. I'm with Equity Policy Solutions. I'm an urban planner and a public health professional, so I really work at the intersection of health and the built environment and community design, and how community design can promote health and equity and wellness. So I work also around the country with different communities on comprehensive plans and transportation plans, and trying to incorporate equity and health promoting strategies into development. And Bill and I talked a little bit about each of these questions, and I think for cultural intelligence, he pointed out knowing each other, being inquisitive about each other in community so that when there is a crisis, that you know each other, you know your neighbors, and you already have bonds. And that's really probably more important than ever in our current environment, too.
Great. Thank you, Gretchen. We'll start with another question. what keeps people of different cultures from engaging in public discourse? Gretchen, we can start with you.
Yeah, I think, I think people are afraid to share their position, especially in our more polarized political environment recently. And I think it comes out in ways in the data. I know I've seen recent statistics, for example, about road rage. Road rage is on the increase. Those violent confrontations are on the increase. And I think that something like that happens in the built environment on our streets really is a symptom of that larger problem, which is that polarization and not knowing each other well enough to work out our differences in community. And so that's just one way that we see in our world where that polarization comes out. So I think that people are maybe afraid or don't have the tools, to kind of build those bridges and communicate. And so I hope that, events like this and opportunities like this in community can really help to build those bridges. And I know you had some thoughts on this question too.
It's an interesting question because the answer is as varied as the people. So everyone has their own reason as to why it is so challenging right now to have an impactful public discourse. I mean, we have public discourse and it goes from like 0 to 100 really quickly, and people can feel like they're being othered just because they don't agree with each other. And so I think some of it is socialized. So we're getting these message on a society level, not just in our country, in our whole world, that there's so much that disconnects and divides us. And my experience in talking with people is that there's so much more that connects us. And so I think the challenge is finding those connecting points. And it could be a connecting point around our families or our beliefs or our values or just the things that are important to us. And sadly, I think for some people, it's this idea that if I share something, you have to agree with me. And if you don't agree with me, then you're the other right away. And people don't realize that we have never really agreed with each other for a long, long time, and that the approach to dialogue is not about agreeing with each other. It's accepting that even though we have a different perspective, we're part of the community. You're my next door neighbor, or I work with you, or your children are friends with my children. And so there's a lot of socialized fear. And then when you couple that with how free people are to say things about other people on the internet, that adds another layer to it, because there's really no control over what somebody can say or how they can take a small snippet of something that you shared and take it out of context. And so a lot of the folks that I've worked with, they're not as afraid to say something that doesn't come out right. What they're more afraid of is how they're going to be treated by the people who hear it, because that has gotten volatile to the point where people are driven into being silent. And so I think that the challenge is how do we move through the times that we're in and realize that even though we have different ways of getting where we need to go or expressing it, that we all have the best interest in our community to solving these. And Gretchen and I were talking, and I looked at what happened in Boulder this week, and that was a very horrific event. And I think Gretchen mentioned this crisis-oriented, and I think we, in many ways, are a crisis-oriented society. And when a crisis happens, it's amazing to me how people who would never be at a table together, all of a sudden, everyone comes together. We're all talking about unity and community. And then my question is, where does that go after the crisis is over? If we have the capacity to do it, then why don't we just do it all the time and just stay engaged with each other? Because what it tells me is that we all have the skill base to connect with each other and to support each other and help each other. We just use it selectively. So it's a really interesting conversation with people that I work with. And when we have these conversations outside of judgment and blame and shame, it's just an inquisitive opportunity to get to know another person. So, and the thing we shared about these questions is we could spend all night on just one because they keep going deeper and deeper, but I'll let you
Well,
jump
I think,
in.
yeah, one of the other questions, we got kind of a list of questions to think about and talk about. The flip side of that, of what, what keeps us from engaging. The flip side would be, what are ways that we can engage and connect with each other? And I think in community, when you're talking about a town or community building, I think festivals are one of the best ways to bring people together, like food festivals. Everybody loves food, and everybody has their different favorite types of ethnic food, and fresh produce, and food with memories. And I think food festivals just are wonderful. They're just they just bring people together of all walks of life. Music festivals, art festivals, things that, as Bill said, we may believe different things politically, but we all have so much more in common that we share. And these are some of community ways to really bring people together and build those bonds. And it's important then to have the actual physical spaces in your community, to have those social gathering places where people can naturally connect. So plazas and, public squares or town parks that can host, festivals and food trucks and things. The built environment really plays a role in helping to bring people together. So that's one idea.
Any further thoughts on that, Bill?
Well, I think the challenge is just getting people to come in and have a positive experience. And so getting people to talk with each other. So I worked with a group in Weld County this week, and it was a group who hadn't been involved in a lot of the conversations in education. And so the superintendent brought everybody together and set it up to where they could just freely and openly express their point of view, regardless of what it was. And some of them told stories about how they had been marginalized or not heard, and the leaders who were in the room just took it in and listened, and they didn't get defensive and they didn't justify. And so it created an opportunity that we can then springboard off of in the fall to then talk about how do we stay engaged, because we asked a series of questions about, did you feel like your voice was heard? Did you feel like you were honored and respected? Did you feel like you could say what needed to be said? And for the most part, that all happened. And so I think there are ways to have these conversations. They become highly emotionalized so really quickly. And so when I was on the school board here, I thought, let's just talk about things like buildings and curriculum, and I soon realized that every single conversation is emotional because you're talking about somebody's child. And so the ability to work through emotionally charged conversations is also really important, because you don't want to tell somebody, no, you can't be angry, or no, you can't be excited, because these conversations bring up a lot for people. And so I think that's another piece of the conversation, is that we have to be able to allow for whatever emotions in the room that people bring to be a part of the conversation.
That's great. You mentioned Weld County. I wonder if there's any other communities or case studies that you have that have been successful bringing people together and seeing really good results there.
So I do a lot of work in education, and I have schools that I've worked in where when I got there, the culture was divisive, people weren't working together, and of course, then it affects children and families. And so I would go in and do workshops. So I've done some around bias awareness or conflict transformation and leadership development, and be in their space for about 3 months. And the approach is really experiential. So people are talking a lot to each other. And what I found in many communities and organizations is people know more about what each other does versus who each other is. And when you start to learn about who this person is, it changes the way that you see them. And what I heard just this week from one of the community superintendents is that the dynamics of this school have changed and done a complete 360. And it's not because I'm still there, it's because they've all chosen to do their own work and to create this culture that is more collaborative, more connected. They've stopped blaming each other. And so I think the biggest piece is everybody has to do their own work, and everybody's own work is different. And so you can't go into a space and say, well, you need to do this and you need to do this. It's more about how impactful is what you're doing in terms of getting you what you want in your community, in your schools, in your workplace, and things like that.
I think to answer your question, Alex, about what are examples of things that communities do to bring people together. I was actually up in Canada last week and learned about a comprehensive plan that's going on up there with the Uje Bugumu Cree First Nation up in Canada, and they're doing their community plan like you are. And one of the projects they chose to do together was to make a community quilt. And so they made a quilt that is 30 feet long by about 10 feet wide, and it's made of individual kind of diamonds that the community came together. They had sewers and quilters teach them the basics of how to create their diamond. And then they each created their own art, their own messages. They wrote on it. And it was all stitched together into this star pattern. And it was fascinating. And it really brought together cultural pride and values and making something together and art and the history of the community. So I thought that was just a fascinating project to bring people together and share that community building. A couple other examples. I do some work out in California also, and one community has a local baseball team, and I think it's maybe single A or double A, but they organized a big evening at the baseball game where everybody would commit to walk or wheel or roll to the baseball game instead of driving their cars, and had a big picnic and celebration and everything, but supporting physical activity and learning ways to get around the community with active transportation, and then coming together at the ball game. And then another example is that some communities organize walking clubs, but we call them moais, walking moais. And moai is a Japanese word that means like your community of people, your, sort of your pack, your special group of people and friends. And so they're organizing, regular moais to walk together, take walks in the park, have their physical activity together. So those are just some ways that communities can really do things together and build that cohesion together.
Those are great examples. It was a good time. Anybody from the audience have any questions? Yeah.
First of all, I have to say that I'm thrilled that the town of Superior has places for us to get together. And so having this town hall and then the community center, and I'll talk about two examples of just that I recently experienced. We had the goats throughout the town eating the grass.
Yep.
And the people that have that company invite the town to get together with their kids and go visit the goats. And that was just an amazing experience for me, because I walked from my house to the park near Safeway, and there are hundreds of people that come out that you never know that they're there with their children. And they gave everybody little things of food to give the goats, and it was just amazing how instantly people were talking to each other. Mm-hmm. It was a beautiful afternoon. They've done that, I think, several times, but that's a unique thing, I think, to Superior. But one comment I'd make is, I think maybe within the last year and a half at the community center, we had a huge turnout for a discussion about the Rocky Mountain Care Group. Hundreds and hundreds of people from Superior were there. I think everybody felt heard. We had many government representatives there. The question I wanted to ask you is, can you have those get-togethers without the people that you're talking to promising to take action? So even in an education center, people can get together and talk, but do you feel that it's effective if the people we're addressing our concerns to are not committed to taking action in terms of the diversity of people?
Okay, so let me see if I have the question correct, is that if when we bring people in and we ask them to be really open and transparent, if the leaders aren't really taking action or aren't committed to taking action, can it really be effective?
Yeah, can it backfire or?
It depends on how it's structured. So I've done some that they've just called listening events, and the leaders are there. They're at tables with the community, and they're interacting, and they're really taking in information because they don't want to take over the conversation. So if it's structured that way, that we're inviting you to an event where we really want to hear, and that the community has actually formulated the questions based on what is important to the community, then it can work very well. I think where it can backfire is when you don't lay out the parameters for why you're inviting people in. Because there are some times when there's an action that has to be taken, and this information is going to be used to drive whatever decision is being made. So I think the main piece is just being really clear about this is the purpose of our time together.
Setting expectations.
Yes, so that you understand that. Yeah.
Do we have another
Was there another
question?
question?
Yep.
We generally get fairly low responses when we do surveys. We might get 100 to 200 people, but the town probably has 8,000, 9,000 adults in it who you could hope would respond. What could we do to try and increase the number of responses?
Are these surveys that the town is sponsoring?
Yeah, the town sends them out
Okay.
to residents and says it'll be open until such and such and time.
Online?
Both actually. Like an example would be the pools. Currently, they had an in-person engagement with pools to see what the public wanted for pool upgrades and everything else. It's pretty muted response for sure.
And it tends to be the same people that respond every time. So we're only hearing from 200 people
Yeah.
over again.
So just to repeat the question for the Zoom recording. So how do we get better response rates? It sounds like the town has low response rates to surveys with the adults. I'm sorry, what?
And diverse response.
And diverse responses. Good point. That's a hard one. I think, if you're sending it online, you're reaching a certain percentage of people maybe that have signed up for the newsletter. You're reaching people who have probably high-speed internet access at their homes, which not everybody does, or that they have a smart device where they can, receive and respond to surveys, which not everybody does. Sometimes it might be effective to try to solicit responses to go to where people are, for example, at, festivals or, events, back to school night or some, things where people are gathered anyway for a purpose, and perhaps have a quick, have tablets and have maybe a 5-question response or something there. So finding people where they already are so that you're not kind of asking them to step out of their day and do one more task. That could be an effective way to get the response rate up. Do you have any ideas, Bill?
Yeah, I think it's been interesting. I've worked with this question in a number of communities, and the email is really challenging because we're all inundated with hundreds of junk emails every single day, and you're just used to hitting delete, delete, delete. And so what we found, though, is that pretty much everybody has a cell phone. So we went to putting surveys on cell phones and just texting it and letting people know what it was. They were shorter, so it was something that somebody could actually do on their phone. And it was maybe 3 questions or 4 questions. And they didn't have to have a response box. It was just, here's a number of options, pick which one. And our response rate went up about 30 or 40% when we started to use the cell phones so that we could gather information. And when you're working with non-dominant communities, so communities who don't reflect the dominant culture in any community, there may be a whole variety of reasons why they're not engaging. Could be a lack of trust, could be not knowing, it could be they're not set up with the emails that come up. And so the way to...
Language.
Yeah,
Language
language
barrier.
could be a barrier. So one of the most effective ways to communicate with those communities is to get to know the elders in the community. Who are the people that people have a high level of respect for, and how do you go in and engage them and say, this is why we're reaching out to your community, because we really value your voice. We don't hear enough of it in the issues that we have going on in our community, and we think it's really important that you're part of the conversation. And so that's another way to go about finding people who are more diverse. When I hear you say diverse, I'm thinking you're meaning age, race, ethnicity, all the identities that we talk about in terms of who we are. And so, and there are communities who have been marginalized historically that are not as trusting in a city or governmental approach, even if it's a question about a pool, something that my kids are going to go to. When you see the city, there might be like, oh, great, what's that about? So even front loading why it's important, and I can't tell you the impact though of when you meet somebody in the community who knows everybody, when they say, come to this meeting, I've had like 20 new people that came because one person who knows them said, it's something that's really going to be of value to us, and please join us. So I think we just have to be a little more creative, because I think we think that everybody's checking their emails, and we all are. And I don't know about you all, but I get 80% of the emails I get every day are not related to anything that I want to talk about. So I think that's one way to do it. Personal outreach is always great. People are surprised when you actually call them, say, we'd really love to see if you could come to this meeting, or like the meeting I told you about in Weld County. One of the things we asked them is, when we meet again, bring another person. And so they had a really positive experience. So I'm pretty sure that we're going to double the attendance the next time we invite them in, because they'll bring somebody else. So I think it just takes being a little more creative. And I think, to Gretchen's point, going to where they are, whether it's community events, whether it's churches, whether it's just things that are happening in the town where there's a lot of people, that you can start to make those relationships.
How did you get the cell phone numbers?
The question was, how did you get cell phone numbers? We asked people, what's the most effective way to communicate? And the majority of them said phones. And we said, great. So on the sign-up sheet, go ahead and put your number, and we'll keep track of that. So the people who wanted to stay engaged would put their numbers down. You'll always have folks who will come to anything and aren't going to be as interested in engaging, or may not want to give that. So we just asked, and people were open to using that as a form of communication.
So you had to do this in an event where there were a lot of people present, so they could actually write down the numbers.
Yep. And it was worth it to us because we were really committed to getting a diversity of voices. So that's why we made the effort. And there was like 4 or 5 people who were engaging with different folks at this particular meeting, and asking them all the same question and getting the information. And so they knew that we were doing this because we really wanted their voices to be a part of the conversation. It wasn't just so that they could get inundated with more emails or more text messages. So it goes back to the context of, why are we doing this?
I think another point on community engagement is that often when we're doing community engagement, we are trying to get diverse voices and make sure we get the voices that reflect the whole community and not just the usual people who show up to the meetings and have something to say. And often, we might, or I can use myself as an example, we might call the very same local nonprofit that, say, for example, in Denver, that is a predominantly Hispanic, nonprofit organization. And, we call them often and say, well, we'd like to get your opinion on this. We'd like to come and talk to you about that. We'd like to get your input on this. And it can feel like a one-way street. You're coming to them and asking them to give you something, which is their opinion, their thoughts, their time. And, what do they get in return? What's the exchange in return? I think managing expectations is important. If you're saying, we want to hear your thoughts and here's how your input will be used in the city process or the decision-making process, instead of just saying, what do you think about this? Thank you very much, goodbye. And then especially when these communities feel like they're just being, it's check the box. Well, let's go talk to the Hispanic community or let's go talk to the Asian community, get their opinion, and then we've checked the box. So really being aware that that's not the kind of engagement that builds trust over the long term. And as Bill said, going to trusted elders in the community or asking permission to come to an event and share about what you're doing, and then let people express interest if they really want to participate and share their time. We often, in my work, when we ask people to sit down and have a conversation, we'll often, give gift cards or something to compensate them for their time if it's a longer discussion, because we as consultants or city staff are getting paid for the time we're spending on the project. But when, we ask community members to come and share their opinions, particularly people that might be working a couple jobs and trying to juggle life, that's a big ask. So just being aware of, who you're engaging with, why you're engaging with them, and trying to be respectful and build that trust to get their opinion and help them understand how their input will be used.
And I also think it goes back to your question of, if nothing happens, is that okay? And I would say not all the time. Because if I keep inviting you to meetings and all we do is have a conversation, you're going to say, why do I keep coming back? Because it doesn't result in any change. And so at a certain point, we have to create some action steps that are tangible and that you can see and that actually impact you to say, okay, so my input really did make a difference in this approach or that approach, whatever it is. So I think that's important also.
Great question and answers. Thank you, guys. Bill, you mentioned non-dominant residents and communities. What kind of factors seem to be most pressing to those groups?
We have about 20 minutes. It's an interesting question because when we think of non-dominant from the perspective we're at now, we think about it from the perspective of who is the dominant culture. And yet, even within what we would define as a dominant culture are people who have also been marginalized. And so Boulder and Boulder County are predominantly white community. And yet, within that community, there are many people who have been marginalized who would feel like in some ways they don't reflect the dominant culture for a whole variety of reasons. And so typically when we think of non-dominant, we look at race or we look at age or we look at gender or religion or sexual orientation. And I think what's important about the definition of culture is it's really about all of the identity markers that everybody has. And the majority of your identity, I can't see. And so I don't know how you identify. If we look at it just from a racial perspective of someone who's white, first of all, race is a social construct and it doesn't define who somebody is. It's just the color of our skin. And so it's not really a marker that says, oh, this person is this way because of their race. And so it's important to be inquisitive and talk to people about what is your identity. I had a good friend here in Boulder who, when you looked at her, she had red hair and freckles and white skin. You might have thought she was Irish or something like that. And she was actually a native born in Mexico City, Mexican woman. And you couldn't tell any of that until she spoke and heard her Mexican accent. And she would tell me stories about how people would really be open to her until they heard her accent, and then their posture or their demeanor towards her would shift. And so the idea of non-dominant or dominant culture is probably language we need to go away from and start to be more inquisitive about who are you and what has your life experience been. Because what I found is that everyone's had an experience where they were marginalized or othered based on how someone saw them. And we all have a story of where we've done that to somebody else based on how we interpreted them. And so the connecting point is being able to admit that and have those conversations, and then think about, how do I connect with this person even if they're different from me? Or maybe we're so different that we're just two folks who are just going to pass through and not really have a deeper relationship. And so that's why I say it's an interesting question, because it's so individualized, and we want to it's easier to paint these broad stereotypical brushes to people because I don't have to think about it. And yet when we do that, it takes away the individualism of the people within those groups. And I think that's one of our biggest challenges around this conversation in our country, for sure.
I was going to say, as you're talking about that, Bill, I agree. I really don't like that term, non-dominant and dominant, because that implies someone belongs and someone doesn't belong. And I absolutely agree that, we need to think more broadly, because we all have not belonged at different times in different places, despite what we may look like from the outside. And so I kind of flipped that question on its head, and I thought, well, what factors are most pressing to all of us? What themes can we unite us, that no matter who we are, what we look like, where we come from, are important to us? And I think in city planning, as I've worked in for many years, I think, there are certain values that I think everybody wants for themselves and their families. I think living in a healthy place where you can be healthy, I think your children's future and well-being is something that everybody probably shares. Opportunity for education and economic success is something that everybody wants the chance to strive for. A lot of the work I do in comprehensive plans, making sure that everyone has access to parks and green space and nature, a safe, decent housing for your family, the choice of housing that you want that's right for your family. So those are values that I think we share no matter who we are. And I think those are, some of the things that as you're developing your comprehensive plan and your different community plans, trying to keep in mind, that there are underlying values that I think we all share despite who we are, and trying to come up with strategies to really, provide that for people along the whole spectrum.
Any other questions from the audience? Gretchen, you kind of mentioned parks and trails and those kind of topics being important for everyone. I'm wondering if you could expand a little bit more on how to include equity in long-range plans and policies, so a little bit broader in general.
Yeah, I think there are a number of strategies. I think in terms of defining where we are with equity as a town or as a city, there are ways to measure that. One is, for example, in the city of Denver, we developed a neighborhood equity index. So we looked at each neighborhood and we took 7 different factors: access to healthy food, access to parks, and that was measured by, like, say, a 10-minute walk to a park or a quarter-mile distance to a healthy food source, like a full-service grocery store, health status, and education attainment, income level, and life expectancy was one of the measures. And we put it all into an index and measured each neighborhood. And we saw that some neighborhoods had very low access to parks or healthy food, for example. Some had low access to good high-frequency transportation. So we kind of started with those baseline measurements. So you know which communities have less of something than others in terms of the built environment and services that the city can have a role in providing. We also looked at things like vulnerability to displacement. So which communities had like a high number of renters and a low median household income that might be ripe for displacement, so that we could really focus on those communities and help with anti-displacement strategies if people wanted to stay in their neighborhood, but maybe couldn't afford to with property taxes and that sort of thing. And then also looking at diversity of housing. If there are communities where there's, say, one type of predominant housing, like single-family detached, which most of our cities have that mostly, but yet if there are, household types that maybe have a lot of single people or seniors or larger families, or that need different housing types than what the community's offering, that's a way to kind of measure, well, this is our inventory, but yet this is what people need in our demographics and future projections. So what kinds of housing do we need to add so that people can stay in the community? Because people love their communities, but they just need different housing types at different points in life. So strategies to measure equity in your comprehensive plan, that would be some kind of baseline metrics. And then some strategies. So for example, for housing, you could put in a strategy that you're going to preserve the existing housing in neighborhoods that have a high vulnerability to displacement, allow missing middle housing or smaller, townhouses or condos or row houses or that in-between type of housing in all of the neighborhoods so that people have access to goods and services and parks, but with housing choice. Another one with transportation strategies, you could prioritize street safety improvements in some of your high injury network neighborhoods, so places where there's the highest number of traffic fatalities and pedestrian fatalities. You could really focus on those areas for better street safety. Also, you could designate, and this is all toward equity, toward a kind of giving everybody the opportunity to live their best life. Designate street types in areas where you have a high volume of, for example, seniors that may be walking because they don't drive, or children playing, and maybe look at slower speed zones or, different designations so that they can safely move about. And then build complete streets. So when you build streets, build sidewalks, build bike lanes, put trees in, so that everyone has access to a range of mobility and transportation. Tree planting. Definitely there are some neighborhoods or areas of town that have higher tree canopy or low tree canopy, and they're an urban heat island, they're a hotter climate, and then prioritize those areas for tree planting and cooling. Let's see, ensuring that public spaces are well lit, for example, so no matter where you live, you have a quality park or social gathering space that's well lit and feels safe that everyone can use. And then some things like for youth, expanding safe, youth-friendly gathering spaces like Boys and Girls Clubs or after-school programs, so that youth have a way to constructively spend their time, build skills, and there's not a difference between, say, families that have a lot of money that can enroll their kids in traveling sports leagues and things like that, and then other kids don't have that opportunity. So really kind of, give opportunity along the whole economic spectrum. And then even from a city perspective, you might think about prioritizing in the capital budget that underinvested communities are prioritized for some of the capital improvements, in the budget process. So that's really bringing it to the kind of financial decision-making process too, to look at equity. So those are some strategies that kind of across many sectors that you could think about in the comprehensive plan.
That was a lot. That's great. So what I'll just add to that is I think the point Gretchen's making is equity is more about the outcomes of how you differentiate for opportunity, access, and inclusion, because all of those strategies provide some level of opportunity, access, or inclusion for all of those groups who may not have had that. I remember working with a community where they were talking about middle housing, and there was an elderly woman in a wheelchair, and she said to the planners, I don't want you to plan this community so I can just get out my door and go to the sidewalk. I want to be able to roll around the whole neighborhood. I want to be able to take my grandkids to the parks. And they hadn't really thought about that in their planning process. And so without it, she wasn't included, she didn't have access, and she didn't have an opportunity that someone who is able-bodied had to just walk wherever they wanted to go. And so she brought that into their awareness. So that's another cultural piece that ties it back to what we started with. And then they decided, okay, well, now we have to redo our plan because we have to make this so that someone in a wheelchair can access all of these beautiful parks and these nature areas or places where their grandkids or teenagers can be at. So I think that's important too, is we sometimes think of equity as an outcome versus it being a process to differentiate, to make sure that the things that Gretchen talked about, that provided opportunity, access, and inclusion, those are really the outcomes. And it's been misconstrued in this country, especially, that equity means something else. And when you look at it from differentiation, pretty much everyone does that every day. Even as a parent, I didn't treat my kids the same way. I had to differentiate for both of them because they both needed something different. So it's not something that we're not accustomed to do. It's just that how do we extrapolate that to the work that we do, to the planning that we do, and just the way that we see our community, that person's not an other, they're just have different needs, and how do we make sure that we provide for them?
Great answers. Any questions from the group? Yeah, please.
I love the comments you made, Gretchen, about things that should be considered in a comprehensive plan. I've never looked at the town comprehensive plan, and this is the first time I've ever been meeting and discussing it.
Great.
And I would assume it all has to be based on knowing the demographics of your community. So who is knowledgeable in the town superior that can say, because I know we have a lot of plan for higher density, smaller homes, and this town has done so much in terms of growth since I've been here. And I'm wondering, what is the plan for over 55?
I think that's an excellent question.
Yeah. You want to summarize the question, Alex?
So with growth pressures and things of that nature and demographics of the town changing, what specifically is the plan to accommodate the 55 plus age bracket in Superior? For housing specifically. Yeah, that's a good question. We're working on that right now. We're in the midst of that process, and yeah, the town staff could speak a little bit better to it, how they're integrating it right now, and in their work that they do day to day and things like that. As a part of the plan, I think Gretchen mentioned a lot of good strategies, middle housing and encouraging those areas or types of dwelling units that are made for seniors, and again, complete streets, things like that connect seniors to places that are walkable, things like that. And so, this would all kind of come in the comprehensive plan as a part of our recommendations. And then, they're high level. We have goals, policies, and then kind of actions. And so those kind of help accomplish those goals. So using the plan, we can start to integrate those things into the town.
I was going to say a couple things about that. Absolutely, the town should be looking at your demographics both now and projecting out for the next 20 years. And that data are available to say, what's our median age and different age brackets. Are we going to have a larger population of seniors in 5 years and 10 years and 20 years? And then what do we need to plan for in our built environment to accommodate those needs? Most communities are aging, the median age is rising in America, and many communities have a large and growing senior population. I think Colorado, even though we think of ourselves as a young state, we actually have a growing senior population. And in terms of the comp plan, I think aging in place, it will be really important because many seniors want to stay in their homes, but they just need modifications to their homes to be able to do that. And there's many aging in place strategies that you can use. And then also the AARP has a really great age-friendly design, manual that has tons of strategies to really plan for more of a senior population. And I'm sure that missing middle housing is one of those strategies too. So it's important.
Well, and I'll say one more thing. Just because, a lot of the homes in Superior have been built 25 to 35 years ago. So people that bought them when they were young and had their families, and my neighbors are starting to sell their homes, but they can't stay in anywhere near. There's no, just over 55, active, not old. I can't do anything, but still go over 55 communities. And so it's a quandary for some of the neighbors whose kids have just gone to college. They're empty nesters. Young people want to buy the homes because they're having children. But the people who have been there 25 years don't know where to move to something that's active and new but over 55, not 80.
Or maybe smaller or maintenance free. Yeah, maybe ranch style, main floor living. Yeah.
Somebody wants us out of our homes because other people want to buy the homes that have enough room to have.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, I think so many communities are experiencing that, and it is so important to allow in your zoning that you are allowed to build those types of homes. And they might be duplexes or triplexes that are, ranch style, single level, maintenance free patio home style. Yeah.
Yeah.
What's going on in Boulder County, in Superior.
Yeah, even to build off of what Gretchen said, the town doesn't build housing or those things. We can just guide development, private development to do those things. And there are interested developers, I'm sure, and the right people to talk to and encourage and incentivize to build the kind of housing that the town needs. So I think that's a piece of it too, that's how this comprehensive plan comes into that role.
When we mingle, we can talk about specifics of the projects that are going on.
Yeah. Yeah. I have maybe one final question, and this is a question I've received from community members in other communities. They come to me, they say, all this equity stuff is good and fine, but, who's going to pay for it? Why should we incorporate it into our plans, into our designs, into our infrastructure when it costs money, when, even the basics, they feel like their roads aren't being filled or paved and things like that. How do we justify, the equity piece of this to people who say those things?
Well, the first thing I say is that it doesn't cost any money to change your mind.
I like that.
It's a mindset. It's not really an additive that you have to throw money at. It's just how do you shift people's thinking, because you already have city planners. How do you shift their mindset to think about the things that Gretchen brought up? It's just taking it's doing what you currently do differently. So the fact that people think that it costs money, extra money to do this work is false. You can build this in if you have people internal who know how to have the conversation like we're having this evening and push people to start to think about whether it's a planning process, whether it's a transportation process, because when you look at neighborhoods who are most affected by all of those things, they're everywhere now. It's not the wealthy people whose roads don't have any potholes. They're everywhere. And so the idea that this work is going to take extra dollars, it's not really true, because even when you bring somebody in, if they're really good, they're not there to be there forever. They build the capacity and the skill base, and then they leave, and then people who are there take this approach. And so it's more about shifting people's thinking to say that our community is really diverse, and we have to figure out how to differentiate for those needs that people currently have. And so it's more about shifting the conversation than it is about throwing money at it, because I'll be the first to tell you that throwing money at equity and diversity and all these will never resolve the issues that we have, because they're all up here. The way that I see you and the way that we interact is rooted in my own personal experiences with people from your groups. And even the way that I do my work professionally is rooted in the organizational culture. And so I do work with municipalities around leadership development, and we talk about, what are you thinking about when you're looking at open space? And who are you catering to in terms of how you're designing open space, or how you're looking at utilities, or all of these things. So I think that again, if you choose to spend money on it, it's probably more of a performative approach. It's never going to impact the culture. So I'll just go back to that. It doesn't cost any money to change your mind. It just takes awareness. That's what cultural awareness is about. Oh gosh, I learned something new. Let me shift how I interact and look at and deal not just with this person, but also with this approach or this issue that I'm wanting to solve for in my community, whether it's about the pool or housing or transportation.
Well, I love the question, and I love it doesn't cost any money to change your mind. I'm going to remember that one. I think that, none of us is static. And so, today you might say, well, I don't need a crosswalk. I'm in my car all the time. I'm never going to be walking. Well, someday you might not be able to drive anymore. Someday you might get older. Someday your mobility might change. So we all are on the spectrum of, different life stages, and we'll need different things throughout our lives. We may not be able to live in a 2-story home with stairs someday, and we may want a choice of housing. But I think also from a cost perspective, something might cost something to build, but then there's a savings on the other side that is maybe not being considered. So for example, if your community doesn't have good tree canopy coverage, or it's all in the rich part of town, for example, planting trees in the rest of town to really lower the overall heat island effect will really save money and improve health in the long term, save electricity costs for cooling, help with stormwater detention and all of these other infrastructure needs in a community. So some of these kinds of investment, like green infrastructure, can save money and improve quality of life and environmental quality for the whole community. Not to mention health costs. The public health doesn't get factored in very much, but it's a very big part of the equation. So doing something like mitigating pollution, which tree planting also helps with, can actually save money on health costs. And that ripples through to, school absenteeism if students are sick, and the need for more doctors and nurses in an environment where hospitals are closing or there's a shortage of healthcare staff. So I think that, the answer is that there's a cost benefit on every side. And if you look at the true cost and benefit, there are probably more benefits to making these improvements in your community than there are the short-term costs. And not to mention things like when people have to move out and leave the community because they can't find what they need here, whether it's housing or access to nature or the park, that's a loss. That's a community loss. That's a cultural loss when people have to leave. So I think that I agree with Bill, changing your mind doesn't cost any money, and that's a great place to start.
And that is a great note to end on, and we are exactly at 7 o'clock. So we'd just like to thank our panelists for being here today. And just one last plug for next week at Town Hall, June 12th at 6 to 7 p.m., and that'll be economic development. Thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.